It was the hour when the chapel bell marked its dominion over the air with 6 deliberate strokes, each one absorbed by the sandstone walls of St. Aldhelm's, as though the college itself were listening. I had been seated by the window of the King's Arms, half-minded over a pint that had grown warm, tracing the clues of a crossword whose setter seemed to be taking a perverse delight in deception. The clue that had stopped me, "Silence returns when conscience tolls 5, was insoluble at first glance. I looked up when the bell tolled the 5th time. By the 6th, I had my answer, though not to the puzzle. A television above the bar flickered through its routine of headlines, and there he was, Dr. Edmund Prowse, the college organist, photographed beside the chapel organ, smiling faintly as though he knew the camera would outlive him. Respected musician found dead in Oxford Chapel. Natural causes, the presenter said, and carried on to politics. But I had seen the man alive 2 evenings earlier, hurrying through the quadrangle beneath a navy umbrella, nodding curtly at my greeting. There was nothing natural in his haste then, nor in the stillness that followed now. I walked the short distance to St. Aldhelm's after closing time. The porter at the gate was reading a paperback by the glow of a desk lamp, his expression half lost between drowsiness and duty. He told me the body had been removed, the police satisfied with their conclusions. I thanked him, though I couldn't say for what. The quadrangle was deserted, but the air held that peculiar hush Oxford wears after rain, the kind that makes every footfall sound apologetic. Inside the chapel, the scent of wax and cold stone prevailed. I stood near the choir stalls, gazing up toward the loft where Prowse had spent much of his life. A half-burnt candle leaned in its holder beside a closed hymnal. I noticed a faint smear of red on the wooden rail. Not blood, I thought, but wine. Someone had split it recently, and the edge was still damp to the touch. Lewis joined me a moment later, his presence announced by the sigh of the door hinges. He had that look of patient skepticism that years of my company had cultivated. "Heart failure," he murmured, the doctor said. "Overwork." I nodded, though my attention had drifted to the organ. Its pipes stood like sentinels, mute yet observant. I had the strange impression that they knew what had happened. The vestry was tidier than I expected, vestments folded neatly, registers stacked in a small pile. I thumbed through the record of service music and paused at the final entry. Prowse had crossed out Dies Irae in trembling ink, replacing it with Ave Verum Corpus. A softer choice. A surrender, perhaps. I traced the smudge of wine at the corner of the page and wondered if it belonged to the same hand that spilled it outside. Lewis said he'd speak with the chaplain in the morning. I told him I'd prefer to speak with silence tonight. He smiled in that tolerant way, of his half-amusement, half-pity, and left me to it. I sat in one of the back pews, listening to the rain gather itself against the leaded windows. The bell above the tower struck once more, not for the hour this time, but an errant echo, perhaps a fault in the mechanism. Yet it sounded deliberate, like a confession retold by habit. There are moments when Oxford feels older than belief. The stones breathe the corridors. Standing there, I felt the peculiar intimacy of mortality, how near it always sits, unacknowledged beside us. Prowse had played this organ for 30 years. He must have known each register, each imperfection of key, as one knows the rhythms of a beloved voice. To die among those sounds was almost poetic, though poetry often conceals a cruelty of its own. I took a seat at the organ bench. One stop had been left half-drawn tremulant. I pressed a single note. A tremor of sound rose, wavered, and fell into stillness. In that faint vibration I thought I heard something human, a hesitation, a memory refusing to resolve. I closed the lid gently as one might close the eyes of the departed. Back outside the quadrangle shimmered with reflected light. Students hurried past, their laughter bouncing off wet flagstones, unaware that their world had shifted by a hair's breadth. I turned once toward the tower where the bell loomed like a conscience suspended in stone. The crossword clue returned to me then, its answer settling into place as softly as a leaf on water. Guilt. And I knew with that small, sour satisfaction peculiar to my trade that whatever had happened in that chapel it was not yet finished tolling. The morning after Prowse's death arrived with that thin, watery light peculiar to Oxford, the kind that can't quite decide whether to reveal or to forgive. Lewis and I crossed the cobbled quadrangle of St. Aldhelm's, our steps echoing between the cloisters where ivy clung obstinately to the stone. The porter nodded us through without warmth. Death tends to dull the college courtesies. Reverend Crispin Vale awaited us by the chapel door, his hands folded as if in perpetual benediction. He spoke softly, as men do when afraid of disturbing ghosts. Dr. Prowse had been alone, he said, preparing the evening's evensong when the collapse occurred. Heart, most likely. The doctor had warned him about strain, though Edmund, he added with faint pride, never heeded advice that wasn't his own. I followed him into the vestry. The air was faintly sweet candle grease and something metallic beneath it. Prowse's cassock still hung on the peg, one sleeve turned awkwardly outward. On the table lay the service register, open at the previous evening's entry. Vale, with the hesitancy of the dutiful, explained that Prowse had altered the programme at the last moment. Dies Irae had been replaced by Ave Verum Corpus. He thought perhaps Edmund had grown sentimental in his later years. I told him sentimentality was rarely a late acquisition. It merely finds a quieter disguise. Lewis busied himself with his notebook while I lingered over the page. A stain marked the corner wine, unless my eye deceived me, a dark trace feathered by moisture. I asked Vale if communion had been served that night. It hadn't. The bottle, he said, had been kept sealed in the sacristy. He spoke the word sealed as though the wine was sacred, untouchable. I made no remark, but the word stayed with me. We moved to the chapel itself, where silence was the dominant parishioner. The pews lined up in immaculate obedience, their polish reflecting the low morning light. The organ pipes shimmered faintly in the dust. Lewis observed that the place felt too perfect, too arranged. I agreed. Grief leaves disorder. This chapel had been composed for inspection. Julian Keir, the choirmaster, entered from a side door with a sheaf of scores under his arm. A man of nervous energy, his voice carried that sharp timbre of the perpetually over-educated. He confirmed that Prowse had stayed late to practice a new arrangement, though for what occasion he could not say. I watched his hands as he spoke, long fingers twitching like the tails of frightened birds. He said the piece had been lacrimosa, but no such score could be found on the stand. He suggested that perhaps Prowse had been improvising. Lewis asked about Prowse's health. Keir shrugged. He had complained of headaches, though he'd been drinking less, not more. The man smiled, an attempt at levity, but his lips failed to rise above the weariness in his eyes. When I inquired about their last conversation, he hesitated, then said only that Edmund had been unusually quiet, speaking of unfinished work. I thanked him, though his answer felt rehearsed, like a confession prepared in advance. When he left, I wandered toward the loft. From up there, the chapel seemed smaller, almost intimate, a space built for secrets rather than sermons. I ran my fingers over the keys of the organ, still cool from disuse. One of the pedals stuck slightly under pressure. When I pressed again, something thin and brittle shifted beneath it, a scrap of paper, half crushed. I drew it out carefully from a torn piece from a choir attendant's sheet, the corner marked by a faint thumbprint of ink and wine. Lewis asked whether it meant anything. Not yet, I said, though I had already begun to feel the whisper of a pattern forming. Prowse had changed his final hymn, spilt his wine, torn a page. 3 small gestures that, taken separately, amounted to carelessness. Together they suggested intent. The dead often speak best through their accidents. We left the chapel just as the bell struck noon. The sound rolled through the quadrangle, heavy and deliberate, as if testing the air for resistance. Vale paused by the archway, muttering that the bell mechanism had been erratic of late, sometimes striking twice for 1 hour. Lewis joked that even Oxford time couldn't be trusted, but I noticed the chaplain's eyes flinch at the second toll, as though the sound carried some private reproach. Back in the quadrangle, students hurried past us with their laughter light, almost insolent against the solemn stone. I envied them their ignorance, the freedom to cross this ground without the weight of knowing what had happened here. I asked Lewis to fetch the organist's medical report, the locksmith to check the vestry door, and the porter's log for the previous evening. As he went, I lingered beneath the tower. The bell was still swaying faintly, its motion imperceptible but sure, like the afterthought of a conscience unwilling to rest. The ringer had told me earlier it required repair. I doubted that. The fault, I suspected, was human. That evening, back in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and studied the service register once more. The smudge of wine looked darker now, almost black. I thought of Prowse sitting alone, pen in hand, perhaps altering not a hymn, but a confession. I opened my crossword, glanced again at yesterday's clue, silence returns when conscience tolls, and found myself writing the same answer once more, though this time I wasn't sure whose guilt it described. Rain had resumed by the time I returned to the chapel that afternoon, not the kind that announces itself, but the soft, continuous drizzle that insinuates its way through thought. The flagstones gleamed like ink, and the scent of wet stone clung to my coat long after I'd stepped inside. The place was not empty. The choir boys, restless and irreverent, were gathered near the stalls, pretending to rehearse under the nervous supervision of Julian Keir. He greeted me with a stiffness that betrayed irritation more than grief. Discipline, he said, was fragile after death, and boys, like notes, easily fell out of tune. I told him I'd try not to sharpen their despair. He didn't smile. I lingered near the front row, watching the boys whisper between snickers. One of them, fair-haired, perhaps 12, was tracing circles on the music sheet with his fingertip, an absent rhythm of guilt. I asked if he'd sung with Dr. Prowse the night before. His eyes darted to Keir before nodding. He'd heard voices then, not singing, he said, but quarrelling. A man and a woman. She'd sounded angry, frightened perhaps. The boy shrugged, unwilling to embroider, as though instinctively aware that too much honesty is rarely rewarded. When the rehearsal began, I stepped back to the pews, letting the sound rise and fold through the chapel. Their voices lacked conviction, the harmonies dissolved before reaching the roof. I thought of Prowse standing here, coaxing purity from imperfection, knowing full well that the divine and the human never quite coincide. Lewis arrived midway through the piece, rainwater beading on his shoulders. He whispered that the post-mortem report was inconclusive. Heart failure, yes, but no history to justify it. No sign of poison either, nothing, he said, except what one might call providence. He said the word with distaste. I told him Providence rarely keeps such neat records. When the boys were dismissed, I asked Keir about the argument the child had overheard. His face tightened as though the music had suddenly gone flat. He muttered that people hear what they expect to hear, that in old chapels, voices linger. I said the same could be said of guilt. He turned away, busying himself with collecting scores. I noticed his left cuff stained faintly red wax or ink, I couldn't tell, and the tremor in his hand as he folded the pages. When I asked if he'd been close to the deceased, he hesitated just long enough to confirm it. Close in art, he said finally, not in affection. Edmund had the soul of a metronome. I told him a metronome still keeps better time than most hearts. He didn't answer. After he left, I wandered up the narrow stairs to the organ loft. Dust lay over everything like sleep. The pedals still bore the faint outline of my fingerprints from the day before. I sat a while, tracing patterns on the keys, thinking of that torn attendance sheet and the anonymous argument. Somewhere beneath the layers of propriety there was fear, not of sin, but of exposure. Through the stained glass window I could see the cloister court, the rain stippling its puddles into Morse code. One of the boys lingered beneath the arch, staring upward toward the tower as though waiting for the bell. I followed his gaze. The ropes hung still. Yet a moment later, faintly, the sound came, one solitary strike, uncommanded, precise. The boy flinched, then ran. Lewis said it must be the wind on the mechanism. I told him the wind has never been that punctual. We walked together to the gate, our shoes whispering against the soaked gravel. He said he'd spoken with the porter, who recalled seeing a woman in a dark coat leaving the chapel the night of Prowse's death, carrying something like sheet music. Her name, perhaps, was lost in discretion or fear. I said Oxford specializes in both. That night, in my flat, I poured a drink and stared at the crossword untouched from the previous day. One clue waited, an innocent and obstinate voice heard after falling from Grace 6. I let the whiskey warm my throat before writing down the word that surfaced, an unbidden chorus. The irony did not escape me. In death, as in life, the choir never quite sings in unison. Eleanor Prowse lived on the edge of Jericho, in one of those narrow Georgian terraces that have forgotten what warmth once felt like. The curtains were drawn when I arrived, though the faint glow behind them suggested an occupant who had not yet surrendered to sleep. Lewis waited in the car, engine idling, as though proximity to grief were contagious. I didn't blame him. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lilies, the sort florists choose for funerals rather than affection. The widow received me in a room too neat for recent loss. Her hands were folded in her lap, still, pale, as if detached from any conscious purpose. She was younger than I'd imagined, though her eyes had already learned the trick of looking past people rather than at them. I introduced myself, and she nodded with the soft resignation of someone who has met too many men with questions. She offered tea, but I declined. Mourning and civility rarely mix well. On the piano rested a framed photograph of a college choir from another era, faces beaming with that fragile optimism peculiar to youth and uniformity. One face, however, had been scratched out with a deliberate, almost surgical precision. The mark was old, yet its intent had not faded. I asked if her husband had taken the picture. She said yes, a long time ago when he was still an assistant organist. The damaged face belonged to no one of importance. A student who disappointed him, she thought. Her tone was detached, rehearsed. Grief, when tidy, is never honest. I noticed her gaze drift toward the piano lid. Sheet music plays open Fauré's Requiem. The page corners were bent, the notation in places faintly smudged. I asked if she played. She smiled without warmth. Only when the house is empty, she said. The admission carried a weight she did not acknowledge. A half-finished crossword from the Times sat beside the teacup. Across read, "Betrayal ringing through eternity." 5. The answer eluded her, though I doubted she had been trying. I told her it might be chime betrayal, ringing eternity, but the pattern of letters didn't quite fit. She looked at me then, her eyes narrowing, as though she sensed I was no longer speaking of wordplay. Her composure never faltered, though her hands began to move restlessly against the fabric of her skirt. I asked when she had last seen her husband alive. She said 2 nights before his death, after choir practice. He'd been withdrawn, distracted by something he refused to name. She thought it was money. There had been talk of a restoration fund, missing invoices, administrative confusion. I told her confusion is Oxford's most efficient currency. When I asked whether he had enemies, she gave a small, weary laugh. "My husband collected enemies the way others collect books," she said. "Too many to read, none to throw away." I turned again toward the photograph. The scratched face haunted me, not for who it concealed, but for the fact that it had not been removed. Destruction is always more deliberate than erasure. I asked if she knew who the student was. She hesitated, then said quietly, "To Helen Cartwright." She had sung in the choir for a few years. Gifted voice, difficult woman. She paused, eyes fixed on the dust motes in the lamplight. Edmund admired her too much. It was not a confession, merely an acknowledgement of inevitability. Oxford is a city that survives on unspoken affairs. I thanked her and stood to leave. At the doorway she said, without looking up, that the church bells had rung unusually that evening, twice at the same hour. She had thought it a sign. I didn't ask what. Signs are the refuge of those who cannot face causes. Outside the air was sharp with the smell of rain on brick. Lewis leaned against the car, smoking in defiance of his doctor's warnings. He asked how she seemed. I told him she seemed like someone still playing the right notes long after the audience had gone home. We drove in silence toward the river. As we passed Magdalen Tower, the bells began to sound, the hour 1 strike too many, perhaps. I counted them unconsciously, waiting for the echo to settle. There was something in their rhythm that no longer felt accidental. Later that night, back in my flat, I found myself staring at a copy of the Times. The same crossword, the same clue, betrayal ringing through eternity 5. I tried, faith, guilt, an angel. None satisfied the grammar of loss. I wrote chime again, though this time with a question mark. The rain had thinned to a whisper by the time Lewis and I reached the college again. St. Aldhelm's lay under that particular kind of Oxford dusk that blurs architecture into memory. I had asked to see Dr. Adrian Fielding, the theologian, whose reputation for brilliance was equalled only by his distaste for company. The porter warned us we would not find him easily. Scholars of his sort avoided light as one might avoid guilt. We found his rooms in the older range overlooking the cloister garden, the door ajar, as if intellectual arrogance extended to security. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of pipe smoke and disuse. Books towered precariously on every surface, the paper edges curled by damp. Fielding sat behind a desk like a relic at its shrine, thin and severe, spectacles perched too low to serve their purpose. He spoke first, a question more accusation than greeting. "The police again?" I told him yes, but this time the police were interested in theology. He didn't smile. He confirmed that he and Edmund Prowse had been acquainted for 30 years, though acquainted seemed too mild a word for the bitterness that crept into his tone. Prowse, he said, was a musical man without discipline, a dilettante, sentimental to the last note. They had quarrelled, he admitted, about a forthcoming publication. Prowse had accused him of plagiarism. I asked if it was true. He replied that truth was a malleable substance like wax, detective, easily shaped by the heat of envy. Lewis wandered among the books, his heavy tread out of place in that sanctum of dust and pedantry. He asked about the evening of Prowse's death. Fielding's response came too quickly. He'd been in his rooms, working, as always. No visitors, no interruptions. Yet as he spoke, his fingers worried at a small scrap of paper by his inkwell, an absent-minded gesture that betrayed him. I asked to see it. He hesitated, then passed it over with the irritation of a man conceding to bureaucracy. The paper was torn from a letter, its edge stained a deep maroon. Wine again. The same faintly sticky residue I had noticed on the vestry register. When I pointed it out, he said Prowse had sent it to him days earlier, a fragment of their correspondence, nothing more. I asked if I might read it. He declined, with the faintest smile. Theology, he said, is best left untranslated. I pocketed the fragment before he could protest. As we left, I paused by the window. A small table stood beneath it, covered with unopened envelopes and a vase of withered lilies. I noted the irony of their presence. Lilies, again the flower that haunts the dead. Lewis remarked that Fielding seemed the type who could kill a man by lecture alone. I told him words have murdered more reputations than weapons. Outside, the evening bell began its slow recital. I counted 7 chimes before realizing it was meant to be 6. Lewis said the timing mechanism was faulty. Perhaps, I said, but the bell always knows what it's saying even when no one listens. We stopped under the archway, watching rain thread through the lantern light. Lewis asked what I'd made of Fielding. I said he was a man who wrote about faith but couldn't imagine forgiveness, the sort who confuses intellect with absolution. Yet something about the fragment of paper troubled me. Not its words were illegible, but the indentation on the reverse. A line of script pressed faintly into the paper beneath as though written over something else. I ran my thumb across it and felt the ridges of a signature. Later, back in my flat, I placed the scrap under a lamp and tilted it until the shadow caught. A single word emerged, veil. I poured a drink then. The whiskey slowly met the glass. I thought of the chaplain's careful hands, the tremor when he'd spoken of the bell, and the way he'd lingered in the vestry doorway, eyes fixed on that stained register. Outside, the city exhaled its nightly mist, soft and persistent, like doubt itself. Somewhere in the distance, the bell tolled again, as though mocking the idea of resolution. I turned the fragment over once more, its stain now darker under lamplight, and found myself wondering whether sin is ever written in ink, or only in what seeps through. It was near dusk when I returned to St. Aldhelm's, the chapel dim and airless, as if the walls themselves held their breath. The rain had stopped, but the stone dripped with the memory of it. I had arranged to meet Helen Cartwright, the college librarian, though arrangement is perhaps too formal a word. It was less an appointment than an inevitability, a name mentioned once too many times by the living to have escaped the company of the dead. She was waiting in the choir loft where the last of the light reached only her hands, folded neatly on the rail. A woman of 50 or thereabouts with a kind of composure that had learned its strength from disappointment. Her hair was greying, but the face still suggested music, an order beneath the surface, a rhythm that age could dull, but not erase. She spoke before I could. I wondered when you'd come. It was not reproachful, merely factual, as though my arrival had been written in some forgotten ledger. I told her I'd heard she once sang here under Dr. Prowse. She said yes, for too many years, though never enough to forget the echo. We stood for a while without speaking. The air smelt of old polish and wax, of faith made tangible. From the nave below came the faintest tremor of footsteps, a porter locking doors perhaps, or the ghosts of boys rehearsing their mischief. I asked if she knew of any quarrel between Prowse and the others in college. She smiled, not warmly. Oxford quarrels, she said, are like psalms. Everyone sings them, and no one listens. Her voice had the low steadiness of someone who had once known performance, and now mistrusted it. She spoke of Edmund Prowse as a man of genius and cruelty, capable of inspiring devotion in equal measure to resentment. He had, she said, an almost clerical sense of sin and an artist's inability to forgive it. I asked whether that cruelty extended to her. She didn't answer, but her silence did. When she finally spoke again, it was to tell me that he had received a letter shortly before his death. Anonymous, she said, the sort of letter people write when their cowardice demands eloquence. He showed it to her, not for advice, but for confirmation. It was brief, almost cryptic. Something about sin and silence. She said he had torn it up but kept the pieces, which I took to be the most human of contradictions. I asked whether she knew who might have sent it. She hesitated, tracing the rail with one fingertip. People forget, she said, that music is built on pauses. Sometimes it isn't what's written that matters, but what's withheld. Below us, the bell rope hung still, its frayed end brushing against the tiles like a tired conscience. I told her I'd been thinking about that phrase, sin and silence. It had the symmetry of a confession disguised as theology. She said Edmund often wrote that way. He had a fondness for symmetry, for endings that rhymed with beginnings. I thought then of the service register, the change from Dies Irae to Ave Verum Corpus, and wondered what balance he had been trying to restore. When I mentioned the Chapel Restoration Fund, her expression shifted not to guilt, but something gentler, almost pity. She said she'd seen him arguing with the chaplain about it one evening. Vale, she added softly, always believed money should serve God, while Edmund suspected God preferred to serve money. I asked when this had been. The night before he died. The light had faded entirely now. The loft was a geometry of shadow. She looked toward the empty choir stalls where the candle holders gleamed faintly in the dark. He played here that night, she said, after everyone had gone. I heard him through the library window say the same hymn over and over. When the bell struck 9, he stopped. And then nothing. I asked how she could be sure of the hour. She smiled again, that sad, knowing smile one sees on those who remember precisely what they wish they could forget. Because the bell rang twice, she said. It shouldn't have. I left her standing there in the half-light, her face turned toward the organ, as though waiting for it to speak. Outside, the mist had thickened, the city reduced to outlines and glimmers. Lewis met me at the gate, asking what she'd said. I told him she'd given me what every witness gives, half the truth and the whole emotion. He asked if I believed her. I said belief was a word better suited to chaplains than detectives. But as we walked away, the bell sounded once, sharp and clear, and I thought of that phrase again, sin and silence, and how often one becomes the other. I found it by accident, which is to say, in the only way truth ever chooses to be found. Lewis had gone off to interrogate an electrician about the chapel's faulty bell mechanism, and I was left alone among the pews. The morning was grey but not cold. Light fell through the stained glass in fragments, tinting the dust with solemn colour. I had come only to think, to sit in the echo of silence that Prowse had once conducted so carefully. But thought, like music, has a way of obeying its own score. It was the choir boy's hymnal that betrayed itself second from the end, its spine slightly cracked. I opened it, expecting nothing more than mildew and sentimentality. Instead, between Abide with Me and When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, There was a thin sheet of onion skin paper folded with the precision of secrecy. The scent of it was faintly metallic, as though words might leave their own residue, typed, not written. Anonymous, of course. A few lines only, uneven in spacing, but deliberate in rhythm. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Sin is not silence, but echo. I read it twice, then again, though it seemed to change slightly each time, as if the words were listening back. When Lewis returned, damp and sceptical, I showed it to him. He frowned in that way he does when the world refuses to be practical. Another poem, he said, another ghost. But I couldn't dismiss it so easily. The quote, lifted from Donne, was one Prowse had used often in his sermons on mortality. Only here it was twisted, made personal, accusatory. A letter not of faith, but of farewell. The hymnal belonged to Helen Cartwright's section of the choir. Her name appeared faintly penciled inside the cover. I asked Lewis to trace who last used it during rehearsal. He muttered about handwriting and dust, but I could tell he was intrigued despite himself. Oxford has that effect. It convinces even the skeptics that paper can bleed. I stayed behind, alone with the letter. The typewriter had misaligned slightly on the word echo, the final O drifting upward, as though the writer's hand had trembled. The ribbon was old, nearly exhausted. I knew the type of Olympia SM9, the sort the college secretaries favoured 20 years ago. One of them, I recalled, sat on Vale's desk in the chaplain's office. A coincidence, perhaps? Or the only kind of connection Oxford ever allows, one obscured by time and piety. When I stepped into the cloister, the fog was beginning to rise again from the river. The bell rope swayed faintly, unprovoked. I found myself listening for the next toll, wondering whether it would come unbidden, as it had before. Instead, there was silence, that charged, expectant kind that feels like a held breath. I walked across the quadrangle to the library. Helen was there, bent over a pile of manuscripts, her reading glasses resting on the open score before her. She didn't look up when I approached. I told her we'd found something, a letter hidden in a hymnal. Her fingers froze mid-turn, resting against the paper like a reluctant pianist. She asked, after a moment, whether I believed in coincidences. I said I believed in patterns. She nodded once, slowly. Edmund did too. He said everything was a repetition, waiting to be noticed. I asked if she recognized the letter. She said only that she recognized the sentiment. When she rose to return a volume to the shelf, I saw her hand tremble slightly. Not fear, I thought, but the effort of control. On the table she left a slip of parchment, yellowed and half-torn, a list of organ stops names in Latin, faded pencil annotations beside them. I pocketed it without comment. That evening, back in my flat, I studied both the letter and the parchment. One was written by machine, the other by hand, yet both bore the same small imperfection, the substitution of ire for ira, a scholar's slip or a signature. The fog pressed against the window like an unspoken thought. I poured myself a drink and unfolded the letter one final time. Beneath the quote from Donne, barely visible, was an impression left by a pen pressed too hard on the sheet above it, a faint curve, almost forming a name. I traced it under the lamplight until the shadow deepened. A single letter emerged, then another. var, the rest refused to appear. Somewhere in Oxford the bell began to toll again, low and uneven. I counted 6 strokes before realizing it was well past 9. The sound lingered, blurred by distance, and I thought of that final line, "Sin is not silence, but echo," and how very much I had begun to believe it. By the time we reached the porter's lodge, dusk had smudged the edges of the quadrangle, and the air carried that faint chill, particular to Oxford evenings, the hour when scholars turn to whiskey and regret. Lewis walked a step behind me, his silence as steady as the rhythm of his shoes on stone. We had come to speak with the college bursar, a man whose name, Tilbury, promised dullness and delivered it with conviction. His office smelled of dust and polished gilt, papers arranged with clerical precision, a decanter half-emptied beside the inkstand. Tilbury looked up as we entered, his expression one of polite apprehension, a man accustomed to secrets but unprepared for their consequences. He knew why we had come. He told us, after some mechanical protest, that Dr. Prowse had been conducting a quiet audit of the chapel restoration fund. Certain payments, he admitted, had never quite reached their destination. Small sums dispersed with care, donations redirected into other accounts, none traceable without effort. Prowse had confronted him 3 days before his death. He said the organist had been calm, too calm a composure that felt less like forgiveness than decision. Lewis asked what that decision might have been. Tilbury hesitated. He suspected Edmund had intended to bring the matter before the college council, perhaps the bishop himself. I asked whether anyone else knew. Only Vale, the chaplain, he said, looking away. He helped mediate, a good man, but too fond of absolution. Outside, the chapel lights were already dimming. I told Lewis to fetch the council minutes and left him to the paperwork. I preferred silence, and the chapel offered plenty. Inside, the faint smell of candle wax lingered, as if faith itself had burnt too quickly. I sat near the back, listening to the echoes settle. Julian Keir appeared from the vestry, startled to find me there. His face was thinner now, his movements too deliberate. He said he'd come to collect a few scores he'd left behind. His voice trembled slightly on the word scores, as though it carried another meaning. I told him about the missing funds, about the audit, about Prowse's discovery. He stared at the floor, muttering that Edmund was a moralist who mistook truth for virtue. I asked whether he'd feared exposure. He laughed, then a brittle sound that cracked the stillness. "Exposure?" he said. "No, Inspector, only memory." When he turned to leave, I noticed the ink stain on his sleeve was a small mark, shaped like a treble clef, or a confession in shorthand. I told him so. He said it was nothing, just an accident with the choir register. But I remembered that the page in question, the one marked by wine, had also carried ink of that same blue hue. I let him go. The truth is never caught by confrontation. It waits, like dust, to be noticed. Later, as the last bell sounded, I stood beneath the tower with Lewis. The sound rolled unevenly, one note lingering longer than the others, a hesitation between tones. He said it was a mechanical fault. I said it was human. The chapel, I told him, was out of tune. He gave me a puzzled look, but said nothing. I had begun to think about the organ again, that instrument of precision and deception, how one can strike the right key and still make the wrong sound. False harmony, the phrase, lodged itself in my mind like a refrain. Back at my flat, I poured whiskey and opened the small notebook where I keep the fragments of cases' thoughts too fragile for reports. I wrote down 3 words: Vale, Keir, Cartwright. Beneath them, I added a question mark. Then, almost without thinking, I drew a small bell beside each name. The bells of St. Aldhelm's, the letters of accusation, the echoes of sin and silence, each had begun to ring with the same dull note. As I sat there, a pattern began to emerge, faint, incomplete, but insistent. Prowse's death, the missing funds, the altered hymn, the wine stain, the repeated tolls. Everything circling back to the same sound repentance performed but never felt. The next morning, before dawn, I returned to the chapel. The organ stood silent, the air cold and still. I pressed one key, middle C, and heard a faint rattle behind the pipes, like paper caught in the mechanism. I reached in and drew out a torn page of music, written in 2 hands. One neat and formal, the other shaking, unfinished. The first line read Ave Verum Corpus, the second in a different ink only 2 words. Forgive me. I stood there a long while, the dawn light creeping through stained glass, tinting the confession in crimson and gold. The note of the bell still trembled in the air, unresolving. Some truths, I thought, refused to reach their final chord. It was one of those evenings when Oxford seemed to hold its breath, the light receding like a secret. Lewis had gone home, content with paperwork and half-truths, while I found myself once again at the chapel door. The porter looked up from his crossword, the faint glow of the desk lamp softening the age in his face. He asked if I meant to pray. I said perhaps I did, though for what, I wasn't sure. The organ stood in the gloom, its pipes catching what little light remained. Dust floated in the air like tired applause. I had come not for revelation but for reassurance, to make certain there was nothing left to be found. But something in me, a disquiet as steady as breath, knew otherwise. The keys gleamed faintly beneath their film of neglect, one of them misaligned, a flaw too precise to be accidental. I pressed it gently. A hollow click, followed by the faintest rustle from within. I reached under the lid and found a folded sheet wedged beneath the wood. Paper, old and fragile, its edges browned like autumn leaves. The ink had run in places, but the words remained legible, a short melody, handwritten, annotated, for H. 3 measures of music, no longer than a sigh. At the bottom, a note in smaller script. We all play the same hymn sooner or later. I recognized the handwriting. Vales, the chaplain, the same looping ascenders, the same restraint. I remembered the scrap from Fielding's desk, the signature barely visible in the indentation of the paper, Vale again. And Helen Cartwright's admission the bell rang twice that night, a pattern too neat to ignore. As I read, the chapel bell tolled outside, a single note shivering through the stone. It sounded almost deliberate, like punctuation. I slipped the paper into my coat and sat for a moment on the bench where Prowse must have last breathed. The air still carried something of him, that blend of candle wax and defiance. I thought of Helen, her voice steady, but her eyes not. Of Fielding's bitterness, Vale's tremor, the widow's tidy grief, and behind them all, the same refrain of guilt humming beneath every word. The melody itself was simple, but its phrasing intrigued me. The second measure repeated the first, except for one accidental, sharpened note that changed the emotion entirely, from devotion to disquiet. It was not music for worship, but for warning. I left the chapel as the rain began again, soft at first, then insistent. The porter had gone. In the quadrangle, the bell rope swung lightly in the wind, moving though untouched. I watched it for a long time. Then, without reason I couldn't articulate, I walked toward Vale's rooms. He opened the door almost before I knocked. His face, composed as ever, betrayed nothing but fatigue. He invited me in with the kind of calm that hides a storm's edge. On the table behind him lay an open Bible, a cup of untouched tea, and a typewriter, an Olympia, its ribbon half-spooled, the same faint misalignment visible in the letters on the page. He noticed my glance and closed the cover gently, as though to spare us both. I told him I'd been in the chapel, that I'd found something. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. Edmund and I were friends, he said finally. We shared beliefs and doubts. I asked whether those doubts were what killed him. His eyes flickered, the kind of movement one makes when struck by an invisible truth. He said quietly, that Edmund had been going to the bishop to confess, to accuse. He wasn't sure which. He'd confronted him the night before his death in the vestry. There had been wine, anger, talk of sin. I asked what happened next. He said the cup had been poured and someone had drunk. Only one. He reached for the Bible as if to steady his hands. Edmund believed in justice, he said. I believed in mercy. Both, it seems, are poor substitutes for love. I left him there in the half-light, the sound of the rain deepening against the window. As I stepped back into the quadrangle, the bell struck once more, not quite in time, not quite in tune. In my flat later, I unfolded the note again, for H. The ink had faded, but beneath the dedication, a faint outline of another letter showed through something once erased, now ghosted in the paper's fibres, not H, but he. The bell rang again in the distance, 3 slow notes carried through the fog. I poured a drink and listened until they faded. It occurred to me then that perhaps the dead never leave Oxford. They simply change the key in which they are remembered. It was the kind of evening Oxford reserves for endings still, airless, and vaguely remorseful. The clouds hung low over the spire of St. Aldhelm's, and the chapel bell, usually obedient, tolled twice for 6, then stopped as though reconsidering its purpose. I walked alone through the quadrangle, the sound of my own footsteps louder than they had any right to be. Lewis waited by the gate, impatient, though his restlessness was not unkind. He'd fetched the final report from the pathologist, nothing unexpected, only the confirmation of what I'd known for days. The wine had been laced, but not with anything modern. A tincture of digitalism, of all things the slow poison of poets and parsons. I told him it wasn't murder in the ordinary sense. He asked if there were ever any other kinds. Inside, the chapel glowed faintly, a last service of light before night claimed it. I asked him to leave me there for a while. He nodded, already understanding the tone that comes before reflection. I sat in the rear pew, listening to the hush, the silence that gathers like thought itself. The organ loomed before me, the instrument of the dead, and I found myself studying its pipes as though they might still contain the residue of confession. The letter, the torn page, the music marked, for H, all of it, converged here, at the same place where one man's conscience had faltered and another's faith had turned lethal. Vale had confessed in all but words. When I'd returned the note to him earlier that afternoon, he'd looked at it as a man regards his own handwriting after years of forgetting it. He spoke not of guilt, but of atonement in the vocabulary of the devout, which I have always distrusted. He said Edmund had wanted to end his marriage, that he'd written to Helen, promising a beginning, disguised as repentance. Vale had intercepted the letter, or perhaps simply borrowed its meaning. He'd gone to the chapel that night, not to argue, but to share the cup. Only one drank. I then thought of the organist's final choice, the substitution of Dies Irae for Ave Verum Corpus, a gesture both devotional and defiant. The change of hymn had not been sentimentality, as the chaplain claimed. It had been premonition, a quiet preparation for death, disguised as worship. I wondered which of them had known first. The wind caught through the half-open door, sending a draught across the candles. One flickered, surrendered, leaving its twin to gutter alone. The smell of wax deepened. Lewis returned, his voice cautious in the stillness. "Vale's been taken to the infirmary," he said. "Collapsed during evensong. Heart, they think, or conscience." I said neither heals easily. He asked if that meant the case was closed. I told him closure was for locks, not people. He smiled faintly as though indulging me and walked back to the porch. I stayed. The air in the chapel felt thicker now, the walls closer. I traced the edge of the hymnal I'd carried, the same one that had once hidden the letter. Between its pages, a faint impression of ink remained, the ghost of a phrase too blurred to read. I ran my thumb over it and thought of Prowse's hand, his final act of order, before chaos claimed him. Outside, the bell stirred again, one uncertain toll that drifted through the open door. It sounded different now, hollow, human. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, the distance between guilt and grace felt unbearably small. As I rose to leave, the last of the light fell through the stained glass, pooling crimson across the floor. The colour touched the organ bench, the pews, the place where wine had spilled weeks before. I thought of Helen Cartwright then, her voice echoing faintly in memory that the bell had rung twice, when once would have done. Perhaps it still did. Perhaps Oxford itself was incapable of silence. Back in my flat, I poured whiskey and stood by the window. The city stretched beneath me, towers, cloisters, bridges, each one holding a fragment of the past like a secret, too precious to confess. Somewhere in the distance, the chapel bell tolled again, steady this time, deliberate. I wrote a single line in my notebook. Every man mistakes harmony for truth, until the last note proves otherwise. The sound faded, leaving only the faint hum of the city and the ticking of my watch that was the most secular of bells. I finished my drink in one slow swallow and let the silence return. It seemed almost merciful.